The morning of the hearing unfolded beneath a heavy sky. The clouds stretched thin and pale like skin over old bones. There was no breeze, no bird song, just a muted stillness that pressed against the windows of the Carter home like a held breath. Inside, Janine Carter moved quietly, her hands steady despite the unease curling at the base of her spine. She had spent the night sleepless, listening to the slow rhythm of Elsie's breath from the monitor, the occasional rustle of blankets, the soft exhale of Beau at the foot of the bed. Elsie had slept, and when she awoke, she had dressed herself without prompting, pulling her gray sweater over her small frame, brushing her hair with quiet determination. She had tied her laces with shaking fingers, but didn't ask for help. That alone told Janine something had shifted. Not all the way, not back to before, but enough. The drive to the courthouse was silent, not in the way it had been weeks ago, when silence meant distance. This silence was different. It was composed, weighted, intentional. Beau sat in the back seat beside Elsie, his head resting gently against her leg, his presence as constant and grounding as the heartbeat in her chest. The Willow Creek Courthouse was an old building with creaking floors and sun-faded portraits of judges long since gone. But today, it pulsed with something electric. The case had drawn attention not just from town gossipers, but from regional reporters, child advocacy organizations, even a few trauma experts who'd heard about the unusual circumstances. A mute girl, a retired service dog, and a courtroom preparing to listen in a way it never had before. They arrived early. Janine walked with her hand resting lightly on Elsie's back, the other gripping a worn leather satchel filled with everything she thought they might need: snacks, tissues, water, even the soft cloth rabbit Elsie hadn't touched in weeks but might want. Beau moved beside them, his golden coat brushed to a sheen, his eyes watchful, his steps mirroring Elsie's in quiet solidarity. Inside the courtroom, the judge had already reviewed the motions submitted weeks prior: statements from Elsie's trauma therapist, letters from the district attorney, and Detective Marcus Lane's formal petition. The judge had granted permission for Beau to be present, not as a pet, but as what he truly was: a lifeline. As they entered, the courtroom hushed. The sound of their footsteps on the wooden floor echoed like soft thunder. Elsie did not flinch. Her eyes scanned the room, took in the long rows of benches filled with observers, the dark-suited attorneys whispering in corners, the flag standing motionless in the still air. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the front row and sat down, her hand automatically finding the thick fur at Beau's neck. Her thumb moved in slow, rhythmic circles. She wasn't anxious. She was anchoring. Daniel Price sat at the defense table, his posture too rigid, his hands folded too carefully in his lap. He wore a navy blazer, his hair combed, his face shaved clean, but no amount of grooming softened the harshness of his expression. The angular jaw, the cold eyes, the way his gaze hovered just over Elsie's head, never quite meeting her eyes, yet never leaving her either. Janine noticed. So did Beau. The prosecutor, Carla Brandt, stood with the measured grace of someone who had handled impossible cases before. Her voice, when she addressed the court, was calm but certain. She acknowledged the limits: no DNA, no fingerprints, no confession. But then she turned to the patterns. She spoke of Price's record, of his proximity to the Carter home, of his movements caught in grainy security footage. She painted the picture that Elsie, in her silence, had begun, and then the room shifted. "Your Honor," Carla said gently, "we'd like to call Elsie Carter to the stand." For a breathless moment, the only sound was the shuffle of papers and the low creak of courtroom benches. Janine reached down and squeezed her daughter's hand. Once. Elsie looked at her, not with fear, not even with uncertainty, but with a steady kind of resolve that didn't belong to children but sometimes bloomed in them anyway, when they had survived something no child should. Elsie stood. Bo stood with her. The courtroom watched as the girl and the dog walked slowly to the witness chair. The judge, a man with kind eyes and deep creases around his mouth, nodded gently. "Let the record reflect," he said, "that the presence of the service animal is not only permitted, but encouraged." Elsie climbed into the chair. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Bo sat at her side, so close they were touching shoulder to shoulder. Her hands rested in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't look around. She simply waited. Carla stepped forward, her voice lowering into something softer, more intimate. "Elsie," she said, "you're very brave for being here. I know you don't want to speak today, and that's okay. You can answer however you feel safest, with your hands, your eyes, or with help from Bo. Is that all right?" Elsie gave a single nod, small but certain. The first few questions were simple: her name, her age, her school, a nod, a slight shake of the head. Occasionally, she glanced at Bo, and Bo, as if wired into her heartbeat, would adjust his posture, tilt his head, mirror her calm. Then Carla stepped back and held up a familiar sheet of paper. It was one of Elsie's drawings, the one with the shadowed figure at the edge of the page, the one with the scar. "Did you draw this, Elsie?" Carla asked, a nod. Carla turned slowly, her hand extending toward Daniel Price. "And is the man in this drawing the man you saw that night?" Elsie didn't move. The courtroom held its breath. The walls themselves seemed to lean in. And then, without lifting her head, without shifting in her seat, Elsie raised her hand and pressed her fingers into the thick fur of Bo's neck. She moved her hand in a small, tight circle, subtle, precise. The signal was unmistakable. They had practiced it at the trauma center. It was not for public use. It was not for tricks. It was a coded gesture, a silent alarm. It meant, "I am not safe." Bo's ears snapped forward. He growled. Low, deep, controlled. Not a bark, not a snarl, but a warning. A presence reclaiming its power. The courtroom froze. No one moved. The judge leaned forward, his hands folding over the bench. Daniel Price stiffened, his face paling just slightly. A tremor of reaction passed through his shoulders, quickly suppressed. Carla's voice didn't waver. "Your Honor," she said, "the witness has just issued a distress signal through her service animal. We ask that this be entered into the record as part of her trauma-informed communication." The defense attorney stood so fast his chair scraped loudly behind him. "Objection," he barked. "That is not admissible testimony. This is emotional manipulation." But the judge raised his hand calmly. "Overruled," he said. "The court acknowledges the unique communication strategies used by trauma survivors. The signal and the dog's response are valid." A murmur swept the gallery, but up on the stand, Elsie remained still, and Bo had not taken his eyes off Daniel Price. Detective Marcus Lane testified next. He spoke about the tire tracks, about the surveillance footage, about the scar, but then he said something new. "We believe Price returned to the Carter home after the incident. We believe he watched, repeatedly. And we believe the child recognized him, not from drawings or suggestions, but from memory." The defense asked for a recess. It was granted, but the air had changed. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, Janine knelt beside her daughter, her arms wrapped around her. Elsie didn't speak, but her posture had changed. There was something solid in her now, something whole. She hadn't said a word, but she had spoken loud enough for the room to tremble. That night at home, Elsie sat at the kitchen table and picked up a crayon. She drew carefully, quietly. When she was done, she held it up to her mother. It was a picture of her and Bo sitting outside the courthouse. the steps behind them, the sky overhead. And no shadows. Janine felt her eyes blur, because this wasn't just survival, this was the beginning of something new. Even days after Elsie's silent yet searing testimony, the courthouse stayed with Janine like a bruise beneath the surface, sore and unseen, a dull ache that didn't go away. The scent of polished wood, the murmur of hushed voices in echoing halls, the feel of every second stretching itself thin as paper, these things haunted her. But what clung to her most wasn't the setting or even the trial itself. It was what she had seen in her daughter that day. It was what had awakened. Elsie was still silent. Her lips had not parted in speech, not even in a whisper, but the silence had changed texture. It was no longer a wall. It had become a door left slightly ajar. Janine could feel it in the way Elsie carried herself, her posture straightener, her steps more sure. She hadn't returned to the bright, chattering child she'd once been, but something inside her had rerouted. The fear no longer held her hostage. It lived beside her now, acknowledged but not all-powerful. In the afternoons, Elsie hummed, not loudly, and never a full song, but a kind of undercurrent as she colored at the dining room table or helped scoop food into Beau's bowl. Janine didn't interrupt the humming. She didn't ask questions. She just listened. It was enough. For now. The legal process, however, was far from finished. Price's defense was relentless. Every motion they filed, every effort to discredit Elsie's unique form of testimony made Janine's stomach knot. They called her silence into question. They attempted to define trauma as unreliability, but Janine no longer feared their arguments because she had seen the truth, and so had everyone else in that room. Then, 3 days after the hearing, Janine received a message from Tessa Groves, a local journalist who had returned to Willow Creek after years covering national stories. Tessa's note was measured and respectful. She didn't want a headline, she wanted to investigate, not the trial, the pattern. They met early in the morning at a small cafe nestled beneath old oaks on Willow Street. The light filtered in through the slatted blinds, golden and drowsy, and Janine felt the quiet weight of possibility as she sat across from Tessa, whose face was framed with soft curls and eyes sharpened by questions. "I want to be very clear," Tessa said, folding her hands over her laptop. "I'm not interested in sensationalism. I wonder what happened to your daughter, what she was able to communicate. It may be the tip of something wider. I've been tracking similar cases, young girls, similar profiles, small towns. I don't think Price acted alone." Janine blinked, her breath catching in her chest. "You think he's part of something?" "I think he might have been part of something organized, or maybe just connected. Either way, his trail crosses with multiple unresolved disappearances. I've mapped it." She turned the screen toward Janine. The map displayed a red thread of dots, each labeled with dates and names. Every one of them pulled at Janine's gut. "This isn't just about one man," Tessa continued. "It's about finding what got missed, forgotten, dismissed. Elsie's testimony opened a door, Janine, and if you're willing to help me walk through it, I think we can bring light to more than one shadow." Janine stared at the screen. The names weren't familiar. The towns were scattered, distant, but each one carried a silent echo of Elsie. Each one could have been her. Janine wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, steadying herself. "If it means someone else's child doesn't have to sit where mine did," she said quietly, "we'll do it." When she returned home, Elsie was lying in the sunroom with Beau. She was on her stomach, her sketch pad stretched out before her, crayons scattered like petals around her. Beau was stretched behind her, his big head resting on her ankles. The sunlight touched them both gently, casting soft shadows on the floor. Janine lowered herself to the rug beside them. "Elsie," she said softly. Her daughter looked up, her eyes patient, waiting. Do you remember when we talked about being brave for others? About helping someone feel safe? Elsie nodded. There's a woman, her name's Tessa. She wants to help other kids. The kind who don't have a beau. The kind who don't have a mom who believes them. Janine paused, her voice gentle. But she can't do it without our help. Without your story. Elsie didn't move right away. Then slowly, she sat up and took Janine's hand in both of hers. She didn't speak, but her grip was steady. That night, Janine found a new drawing pinned to the refrigerator. This one was different. It showed a row of houses. In each yard was a child, and beside every child was a dog, not identical, but similar to Beau. Some larger, some with spots, some curled up in sleeping positions, others standing alert. A pack of sentinels. A message. They are not alone. While Janine and Elsie opened a new path forward, Detective Lane followed a lead that came unexpectedly. A woman from a neighboring town who'd watched the trial coverage called in. Her niece, now 15, had once been approached by a man who tried to lure her toward a van with promises of candy. She'd run. Nothing came of it, but she remembered the man's hand, the scar. Lane met them at a corner booth in a diner off Route 7. The niece had drawn a picture back then, saved by her aunt. A van, gray, square, plain, and a figure. The left hand marked by a long, jagged scar. It matched. And it was enough. The DA filed a motion to expand the investigation. New officers were assigned. Old reports reopened. What had begun as a single child's quiet distress now pulled threads loose in cases scattered across counties and years. Price's name began surfacing on more paperwork than just Elsie Carter's. But the defense pushed back. They brought in a forensic psychologist who argued that Elsie's communication was symbolic, not evidentiary. That the dog, however well trained, could not be a vessel of legal truth. That silence, while poignant, was not reliable. Carla Brandt, the prosecutor, responded with something unexpected. She called Rex Johansson to the stand. He wasn't a dog. He was Beau's original handler, a veteran, a trainer of trauma support dogs, a man whose entire career had been built on recognizing silent survival. Rex stood tall, his presence calm, commanding. His beard was salt and pepper, his voice low and steady. He didn't use flowery language. He didn't dramatize. I've trained over 70 trauma canines, he said. Beau is exceptional, not because he's the smartest or the fastest, but because of how deeply he listens. That little girl, he looked toward Elsie, who watched him with quiet recognition, has built a bond with him that goes beyond behavior. It's trust, bone deep. He explained the signal Elsie used. He explained how Beau's reaction wasn't reflex, but pattern, conditioned, learned, reinforced. If she sends that signal, he knows it means fear, and he responds, always. When asked directly, did you train Beau to growl at a man sitting 20 feet away? Rex didn't blink. No, but I trained him to protect a child who says she's afraid, and that's exactly what he did. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward. Elsie watched, not with fear, but with understanding. Rex had seen her. He had spoken for her. And in the quiet that followed his testimony, Janine felt something unspoken settle between her and her daughter. After the session adjourned, as they passed through the courthouse lobby, Elsie paused by the community bulletin board. Flyers, police updates, charity bake sales. Among them, tacked low where only children might look, was a sketch, crayon on construction paper. A child and a dog standing side by side beneath a blank sky. Elsie reached into her pocket, pulled out a blue crayon she had tucked there earlier that morning, and gently colored in the sky. A soft, steady stroke. Not just blue, but hope. The summer air in Willow Creek hung heavy, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and something less tangible, Anticipation, perhaps, or dread. The town moved slowly beneath the heat, but inside the courthouse walls, the temperature felt altogether different. There, it wasn't the sun that made people sweat, but the truth, pressing forward inch by inch. By now, the trial had become more than just a courtroom proceeding. It was a reckoning, an excavation of things buried too long, of names left off reports, of voices silenced not only by fear, but by systems that failed to listen. The case of Elsie Carter was no longer just hers. It had become a vessel for stories left untold, for children who never got their day in court. And yet, in the eye of that storm, Elsie remained the still point. Each morning, she entered the courthouse with quiet resolve, still silent, still small, still steady. But something in her presence had grown unmistakable. She was no longer a frightened child being guided by her mother and comforted by a golden retriever. She was something else now, a force, quiet but rooted, a witness who didn't need to speak to be heard. That week, a second anonymous tip landed on the desk of the district attorney. A woman in Monroe County reported seeing a blue-gray van, same make, same model, frequenting a dilapidated motel on the edge of town last summer. She hadn't known who to tell. Her first attempt to report it had been brushed aside. But after watching the trial coverage, she recognized the man's face, even through the distance of her memory and a television screen. And she couldn't forget the scar. Detective Lane followed the lead the same afternoon. The motel, worn and sun-bleached, was exactly what you'd expect from the edge of a forgotten highway. The manager remembered the van. 3 visits over 2 weeks, paid in cash. No name, no ID, but he remembered the man. Scarred hand, talked too much, watched everything. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to connect the dots. Back home, Elsie was changing in ways that didn't always look dramatic from the outside. But Janine noticed everything. She noticed the way her daughter rose with the sun now, brushed Beau's coat with slow, purposeful strokes, and began humming lullabies she hadn't heard in years. She didn't need prompting anymore to feed him or check the water bowl. She initiated touch, soft pats to Beau's head, quick squeezes to Janine's hand, when fear flared in her chest. These were gestures that hadn't existed weeks ago. They were signs of presence, of return. And one evening, something extraordinary happened. Janine was folding laundry when she heard it. Barefoot steps across the hardwood, a soft giggle, the click of the back door. She followed, curious and cautious. Outside, in the golden hush of dusk, Elsie was dancing. Slowly, gently, her arms extended like wings, twirling barefoot in the grass. Beau stood nearby, attentive but unintrusive, his tail swaying with each spin. The moment hit Janine like a wave. Her knees weakened, and she leaned against the porch rail, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled up. Her daughter was dancing again, and in that moment, Janine knew. Her little girl was not just surviving anymore. She was coming back to herself, movement before speech, hope before sound. But not all healing happens at home. In the courtroom, the defense was preparing its most aggressive argument yet. They brought in a forensic psychologist, credentialed, clinical, to argue that Elsie's identification was compromised. Traumatized children, he said, are impressionable. They may form images that validate their fear, not necessarily objective reality. He spoke with an air of practiced detachment, using diagrams and cognitive theory as his armor. But even as he laid out the framework for memory distortion, there was something brittle about his confidence, because no theory could explain the drawing, the red jacket, the scar, the exact location of the van sketched with such precision that it matched a satellite image from nearly a year earlier, uncovered by Tessa Groves, the journalist who had been quietly assembling her own case alongside the state's. And then came the surprise no one saw coming. Carla Brandt, unwavering as ever, called Tessa to the stand. The courtroom shifted, eyebrows lifted. The defense looked momentarily stunned. Tessa walked to the stand with the quiet resolve of someone who knew her truth would land like thunder. She carried a thick binder, organized, color-coded, unflinching. She began with the map. It showed Daniel Price's movements, trucking jobs, motels, temp work from the last 10 years. Then, layered over that, she added pins for 3 missing girls, 3 different towns, all unsolved, all within days of Price's stops. Each one a child no one connected, until now. One had drawn a van. Another, a man with a messed up hand. None had heard of Elsie Carter. Yet their stories formed a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. "Why didn't you go to the police earlier?" the defense lawyer snapped. Tessa's voice didn't rise. "I did, more than once. But it was circumstantial. They said it wasn't enough." She turned, her eyes settling on the jury. "They're listening now." A hush fell, not of shock, but of recognition. A collective awareness that something had broken open, and that it could never again be dismissed. That night, Janine left her bedroom door open again, not out of fear, but hope. She wanted to hear her daughter if she spoke, laugh, cry, hum, anything. But she also wanted to give her space, the kind of space that trust offers. And then, on the eve of what was to be the final day in court, Bo let out a low, restless whine. Janine woke instantly. She found him pacing outside Elsie's room, his nails clicking softly against the wood floor. Inside, Elsie was upright in bed, clutching a crumpled page, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Her crayon had snapped in half. Janine knelt beside her, voice barely a whisper. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Elsie didn't speak, but she reached for a new sheet and began to draw. Her strokes were urgent but clean, controlled. She drew a room, a desk, a figure. Then her hand paused, trembling. She added a door in the corner, slightly ajar. She pointed to it, then touched her chest. "He kept her in there?" Janine asked. A nod. Elsie pointed to the figure's shirt, drew a square shape inside the pocket. Then she sketched a key. Janine's heart began to race. "You think he still has it?" This time, her daughter didn't nod. She whispered, "He still has it." 4 words, clear, certain, and enough to crack the trial wide open. Janine called Detective Lane. At dawn, they submitted an emergency motion to research Daniel Price's belongings. Inside a hidden seam in his wallet, tucked beneath a loose stitch, they found it, a small brass key, worn smooth. The judge called an emergency recess. The courtroom buzzed with urgency, reporters racing from the building, phones ringing in the halls. Within hours, they tracked the key to a storage unit registered under a false name connected to one of Price's old jobs. Inside, they found journals, keepsakes, drawings, names, children's names. The DA immediately amended the charges. The jury, stunned, was dismissed. Price changed his plea to guilty on all counts. The courtroom watched as the man who had hidden in shadows for years was finally exposed to the light. But it wasn't the verdict that mattered most. As the courtroom began to empty, as people gathered their coats and wiped quiet tears from their eyes, Elsie stepped down from the witness box. She walked slowly to the judge's bench and, without a word, placed a drawing on the polished wood. It was of her, standing tall, Bo beside her. Behind them, once menacing shadows faded into soft gray. They no longer loomed, they no longer defined. The judge looked down, deeply moved. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "you may not have said much out loud, but you've told us more than most adults ever will." And then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, Elsie turned to Bo. She gave him a simple, practiced signal, a small tap at his shoulder, a gesture they'd rehearsed during quiet nights when no one else could understand her language. Bo raised his head, looked around the courtroom, and gave a single, proud bark, not to sound the alarm, but to mark the moment. She had spoken, and she had been heard. The air inside the Willow Creek courthouse felt different that morning. It wasn't heavy with dread, as it had been in the early days of the trial. It pulsed with something else now: expectation, reverence, quiet awe. The wood-paneled room was full to capacity, and yet no one made a sound beyond a hushed greeting or the creak of a shifting bench. Teachers sat beside social workers, trauma counselors next to journalists. Strangers from neighboring towns drawn by the weight of the story occupied the back rows. Some had brought therapy dogs, the animals lying quietly at their feet, mirroring the stillness of the room. But everyone's eyes were on the front bench, where Elsie Carter sat beside her mother. Janine's hand rested gently against her daughter's spine, feeling the slow, even rhythm of her breath. She didn't speak, didn't offer encouragement. There was nothing left to say. They had practiced the questions, the protocols, the courtroom etiquette. But now, as the final day of testimony arrived, this moment no longer belonged to instructions or rehearsals. It belonged to Elsie. Bo, as always, was right there. His golden coat had been brushed that morning with special care, and he wore his vest like armor. He didn't fidget or pace. He simply sat at Elsie's feet, still as stone, watching the room with the quiet, measured presence of one who understood that his job was not to defend but to anchor. The judge entered, his expression unreadable but gentle. He was not a man of spectacle. He had served the district for nearly 3 decades, and in that time he had presided over cases that ranged from tragic to trivial. But even he knew this was different. He looked directly at the child before him. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "if you are ready, you may take the stand." Janine felt her breath catch, but she didn't squeeze her daughter's hand. She didn't want to hold her back. Instead, she watched. Elsie stood. It was a quiet thing. She did not rise with a dramatic flourish, nor did she hesitate. Her movements were measured, intentional. There was no trace of trembling, no whisper of fear. The girl who walked to the witness stand wasn't the same girl who had once crouched in the dark corners of her bedroom, too afraid to speak or sleep. This was someone new, rebuilt slowly, tenderly, from silence. Bo followed beside her, pacing evenly, each step mirroring her own. The courtroom didn't breathe. The bailiff looked to the judge, uncertain, and the judge nodded. The service animal may accompany the witness. Elsie stepped up onto the small platform and settled into the witness chair. Her feet didn't touch the floor, but she didn't fidget. Bo curled at her side, resting his head gently against her leg. She reached down, not hurriedly, but with intention, and stroked his fur. The prosecutor, Mr. Wren, approached with quiet respect. He didn't adjust his tie or stack his notes. He spoke as one might speak to someone sacred. "Elsie," he said gently, "do you know why you're here today?" She didn't respond, not at first. Instead, her fingers moved carefully. She scratched behind Bo's ear, then, with a soft tap, pressed 2 fingers to the space just above his shoulder. It was a signal, one they had practiced during long sessions behind closed doors, a signal that meant, "I'm ready." Bo's response was calm but deliberate. He raised his head and let out a soft, single bark. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to alarm, but it was unmistakable. A wave of stunned silence passed through the courtroom like a current. Someone in the gallery gasped, but no one else moved. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Carter?" And then, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, perhaps from her chest or her memory, or the quiet space she had been keeping all these months. Elsie spoke. "I remember him." The words were small, barely above a whisper, but they were crystal clear, and they broke the air like thunder. Janine's hands flew to her mouth, her breath hitched, her chest ached. Mr. Wren's voice remained steady, though something flickered in his eyes, something reverent, as though he knew he was in the presence of something rare. "Elsie," he asked softly, "do you see the man who hurt you in this room?" She turned her head, slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at the defendant, Daniel Price. The man, who had remained composed through most of the proceedings, flinched. His eyes widened, barely, but enough. He looked down quickly, then back up. It was all the jury needed to see. His attorney was on his feet before the judge could speak. "Objection, Your Honor. The child has been nonverbal for months. This sudden testimony cannot be considered reliable. It's emotional, not evidentiary." But the judge raised his hand. "You will sit down, Mr. Price. The child's communication has been evaluated and supported by both medical professionals and legal precedent. Her voice is no less valid because she found it today." The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. But something even more powerful happened. The entire room seemed to lean forward, toward Elsie, toward her voice. Mr. Wren took another careful step. "Elsie," he said, "can you tell us what you remember?" She was quiet for a long time. Bo nudged her hand. Then she spoke again, her voice a little louder, steadier. "He came to the window. He told me I had to pretend nothing happened, that I'd forget." But Bo didn't forget. "And when I saw him again, I remembered his face. I remembered everything." Her words hung in the air. There was no trembling in her voice, only clarity. And something else, release. Mr. Price didn't push further. He didn't need to. "No further questions, Your Honor." The defense attempted a cross-examination, but it was hollow. The damage to their argument had already been done, not by logic, not by forensic data, but by the sheer force of truth spoken plainly by a child who had been told to stay silent. Daniel Price shifted in his seat, his jaw tightened, his posture sagged. His face, once smooth with denial, had begun to crack. Elsie had done what no expert witness, no security footage, no drawn diagram could accomplish. She made the truth undeniable. When the judge called for a recess, people stood, not out of obligation, out of reverence. As Elsie stepped down from the witness chair, Bo walking beside her, the room seemed to hold its breath again. People in the gallery had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others placed hands over their hearts. Some simply bowed their heads. She passed her mother, who rose slowly from her seat, unable to contain the tears that had broken free. Elsie reached for her, no longer the child who needed to be held, but one who chose to give comfort too. "We did it," she whispered. Janine gathered her daughter in her arms and held her tightly, her cheek pressed to the crown of Elsie's head. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones were raised, but none of that mattered. Inside, something sacred had taken place. Something so quiet and yet so powerful that it would be carried in the memories of every person in that courtroom for years to come. That evening, the house was still. The windows opened to a summer breeze. The fear that had once lived in the corners of each room had been replaced with something softer, peace. Janine found a drawing on the kitchen counter. Elsie had left it there without saying a word. It showed the courthouse steps. Bo, sitting proudly at the bottom, his eyes raised. And at the top of the stairs, Elsie, arms outstretched, the sun rising behind her in radiant yellow arcs. There were no shadows in the picture, only light. Beneath it, in careful, blocky handwriting, she had written, "I was silent, but now I speak." The final day in court felt like the closing of a long, heavy book. There was no longer a question of if justice would come, only when. The air in the courthouse no longer held the same suffocating dread that had once wrapped around Elsie like an unseen chain. Instead, it buzzed with something unfamiliar but unmistakable, a quiet, simmering vindication. Outside, reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing, microphones poised. But inside, there was stillness. Not the fearful kind, but a reverent, waiting kind, like a held breath before a long-awaited exhale. Elsie didn't take the stand again that day. She didn't need to. Her voice, few as her words had been, had already echoed through every corner of the courtroom. It had cut through the noise, carved through the doubt, and left no room for shadows to hide. Daniel Price sat hunched at the defense table, his presence diminished, the once smug air he carried now stripped away. He no longer looked like a man confident in his own lies. His defense had crumbled, his stories unraveling with each quiet truth that Elsie had laid bare. The physical evidence, once fragile, had found its foundation in the most unexpected place. The steady gaze of a child, the unwavering bond with a dog who never doubted her, and the drawings that had said everything when she couldn't. Now, there was no more pretending. The jury returned their verdict in under 2 hours, guilty on all counts. When the gavel fell, it did not feel like the end of a trial. It felt like the end of a nightmare. Elsie didn't flinch when the sentence was read. Life in prison, no parole. The words barely seemed to register for Price, whose shoulders slumped under the weight of inevitability. Janine pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her heart hammering, tears clouding her vision. It was over. Or rather, it could finally begin. Elsie leaned against Beau, whispering something only he could hear. The golden retriever nudged her gently, pressing his warm nose against her cheek. He didn't need words. Neither did she. Janine wrapped her daughter in her arms the moment they stepped into the hallway. "You were so brave," she whispered, her voice breaking. Elsie looked up at her. Something soft, something almost like a smile, beginning to bloom across her face. "I wasn't alone," she murmured. That night, they didn't go straight home. Janine drove them out to the lakeside park where Elsie had once spent whole afternoons before fear took root in their lives. The sunset burned gold over the water, stretching soft orange and pink into the sky, like a promise. Beau ran ahead, stopping to look back every few seconds as if to say, "Come on, it's safe now." Elsie laughed, a real, quiet, carefree sound. Janine closed her eyes for a moment, holding that laughter in her heart like a precious stone. She had waited so long to hear it again. A few days later, Elsie's story traveled farther than Willow Creek. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was transformative. The footage of her on the witness stand, silent but steady, her small hand resting against Beau's head, was carried across television screens, news platforms, social media. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice for every child who hadn't found theirs yet. Letters arrived from strangers across the country, from survivors, from parents, from jurors who had once sat on cases just like hers, admitting they hadn't believed children before, but now they would. One letter, written in careful cursive, stood out to Janine. "You helped me heal." Just 4 words, but they held the weight of a lifetime. Through it all, Elsie remained grounded. She never wanted attention. She just wanted peace. But something inside her had shifted. One afternoon, she sat down at the kitchen table and looked up at her mother. "Can you help me set up a folder on the computer?" Janine blinked in surprise. "Of course, sweetheart. What for?" Elsie hesitated. Then, with quiet certainty, she said, "For my stories. I think I want to write." And so, she did. Not to relive her trauma, but to rebuild from it. Her first story wasn't about what had happened to her. It was about Beau, told through his eyes. A story filled with warmth, with hope, with unspoken understanding. When she shared it with her therapist, they asked if they could submit it to a national writing contest. Elsie shrugged. Okay. She won first place. The award ceremony was quiet, respectful. When she was handed the certificate, she simply nodded and said, "Thank you." But everyone in that room saw the way she stood a little taller, and when the crowd applauded, she didn't shrink from the sound. She let it happen. She let herself happen. Janine kept every drawing, every letter, every newspaper clipping, not for recognition, not for proof, but because she never wanted to forget that silence does not mean brokenness. Stillness is not the absence of strength, and sometimes healing begins in the quiet before the voice returns. As the season shifted, so did something else. Janine and Elsie started something new, a small nonprofit partnering therapy dogs with children healing from trauma. They called it the Bow Project. The tagline? Sometimes healing starts with a paw. It wasn't some flashy launch, just a few volunteers, a borrowed community center, and Bo lying in the middle of it all, his tail thumping, like he already knew this was exactly where he was meant to be. And then came the first event. The chairs filled with families who understood. The air hummed with something real, and Elsie spoke, not long, not rehearsed, just a few quiet sentences written on a note card, her voice steady. I used to be afraid of the dark. Then someone stood beside me who didn't need words to understand me, and that gave me the courage to speak. If you're still quiet, still scared, I want you to know, you're not alone anymore. She looked down. Bo, ever constant, lifted his head, ears pricked. Then, just as he had in court, he let out a single, soft bark. Not loud, not urgent, just proud. And this time, when the crowd stood, when they clapped, when they cried, when they held on to each other in the recognition of something bigger than all of them combined, Elsie Carter stood too. For the first time, she didn't just let it happen. She let herself happen. She stood in her own strength. She became her own voice. And she was never going back to silence again. A child's silence became the beginning of a powerful journey, not only toward justice but toward healing. Elsie, once a lively little girl, had her world shattered the night a shadow crept into her home and left her too afraid to speak. Her mother, Janine, a strong, intuitive single parent, knew something was deeply wrong, even when the system failed to believe her. The days that followed were filled with unanswered questions, closed police reports, and a house slowly draining of its warmth. But when no one else could reach Elsie, Bo, a retired service dog with scars of his own, began to bridge the distance. Through quiet companionship, a bond was formed, not through words, but through presence, trust, and the unspoken language of shared pain. As Bo and Elsie grew closer, something changed. Her silence shifted. Her drawings began to tell stories. A scar on a man's hand, a van, a dark figure. Detective Marcus Lane, the one person who had never dismissed Janine's fears, took notice. Piece by piece, the truth came into focus. Someone from Elsie's past was watching them, and he had taken another child before. The investigation led to Daniel Price, a man whose calm exterior masked a horrific secret. When he was finally brought to court, the entire town watched, but justice didn't roar. It came in the form of a little girl who hadn't spoken in months, gently signaling to her dog, and Bo responded. A low, unmistakable growl, one that cut through the courtroom and pierced the heart of the accused. Elsie didn't need to speak to be believed. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her courage lived in the silence she broke with a single gesture. That moment unraveled a monster and reminded a community that truth sometimes arrives in whispers. By the end, not only was a predator brought to justice, but a little girl reclaimed her voice, first with a whisper, then a smile, and finally, a quiet, I missed you. that wrapped her mother in hope. Elsie's story is a testament to the power of presence, the importance of trust, and the courage it takes to believe in what we cannot see. In a world where noise often dominates, we forget that silence too can hold truth. The lesson here is simple but profound. Healing begins where belief begins. For parents, partners, teachers, or friends, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stay, to listen, and to believe, even when there are no words. Trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it stares out a window and waits. We must learn to trust intuition, value the quiet, and never underestimate the power of small, consistent acts of care. And for those who are hurting, your silence is not weakness, it's survival. And when you're ready, your voice will return, just like Elsie's did. And when it does, may the world be ready to listen. That's it for today's video. We hope that you enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating powerful, meaningful content that inspires and uplifts.